Thousands of British prisoners of war are claiming that the government owes them more than £20 million. And tomorrow their case goes to the House of Commons. While they were being held captive during the Second World War, the servicemen had their wages docked by the government on the assumption that they were being paid by the German authorities. Our defence correspondent Tom Carver has this special report for the 9 o'clock news.
These British prisoners of war, some of whom have been in enemy hands for 5 years, are on their way home by air.
The POWs who flocked back to Britain after the war were looking forward to picking up their unused salaries, but many of them were in for a rude shock. What they didn't know was that all the time they'd been in captivity, the British government had been quietly deducting money from their pay back home. For strange as it may seem, under the Geneva Convention, officers and medical POWs were supposed to be paid a basic wage by the German authorities, and at the end of the war, Britain was meant to reimburse the Germans for this cost. Graham King spent 5 years in a German camp as a medical orderly. He only recently discovered that he'd been taxed for the privilege.
The annoying thing is that the vast majority of them did not receive any payments from the Germans, and they did not know that money was being deducted from their pay, from their British pay, by the British government.
In the Public Record Office, the old Admiralty files showed just how much was deducted. A naval captain lost around 1/3 of his salary, and for some reason those unfortunate enough to be imprisoned in Italy were penalised twice as heavily. But when the war finished, instead of paying the money to the German authorities, the British government hung on to it. The POWs say that as much as £1 million was handed over to the treasury. Now, more than 50 years later, those former prisoners of war would like their money back, which is obviously worth a lot more at today's prices. When demobilisation came, the POWs were too excited about becoming civilians to notice they'd been specially taxed, and the government certainly didn't go out of its way to tell them. Only now, after a prolonged campaign by surviving POWs, has the MOD agreed to look again at the old pay records. HUGO BRACHEN, a retired naval captain, was imprisoned for 4 years in Poland. He and his colleagues are more interested in securing justice than in being repaid personally.
What we want is the government to make a generous donation to the service charities to be used to help ex-POWs who are in need and the families of those who have died.
MPs from all sides are sympathetic to their plight.
Sadly, some have died already, and so I want to bring this thing to a proper and I think a fair, what I think the prisoners of war themselves have called the just solution.
It's all aboard for Blighty right enough.
For those who survived the camps, resolving this grievance would represent a final homecoming after all these years. Tom Carver, BBC News.